Okay, sounds good, everyone. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start our discussion today on the congressional chapter. So we're going to be covering Congress today. So let me go ahead and share the screen here really quickly, and then we'll get to our discussion here regarding Congress. Okay. All right, so let's get started here. Okay, so let's go to Chapter 12, Congress. All right, um, so Congress is an interesting chapter. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I could have sworn that I had silenced this. So these chapters that we're going to be taking a look at, of course, like we mentioned, these of course are the three major branches of government. So we're going to be taking a look at Congress, which comprises the federal legislative branch. Next week we'll take a look at the presidency, which of course obviously covers the federal executive branch, and then we'll take a look at the federal courts after that, which of course covers the federal judiciary branch. And the federal courts, of course, doesn't just include the Supreme Court. We've also got circuit courts and district courts. But we'll talk about that when we get to that chapter. So, let's discuss. Let's start with our discussion on Congress here really quickly. Now, I'm sure you all are very familiar with Congress. If you have heard of C-SPAN, then you're probably familiar with Congress, right? Obviously, of course, C-SPAN is the network that covers and not just Congress, but it basically it aims to cover our federal government, right? But when we think of C-SPAN, we normally think of Congress mostly, or we think of them first, because that's usually what we mostly see on C-SPAN for people who do watch C-SPAN, which I watch it every now and then. Um, it is good that we have access to to the to a network that gives us an in-depth look at in terms of the inner workings of our government. But with that being said, let's go ahead and start with our discussion on Congress. So obviously, first we're going to take a look at what Congress is, what do they do. We've looked at this. We've looked at Congress, of course, a little bit in Chapter 2 when we were covering the Constitution, and of course, the first article within our Constitution deals with Congress, and it's also the longest article, right? It's got 10 sections. And so we talked a little bit about Section 8, and that discusses what Congress's job, duties, and responsibilities are. But we're going to go more into detail within this discussion in terms of discussing, obviously, of course, what Congress is, the job that they do, who tends to serve in Congress, and looking at some of these broad responsibilities. We're going to take a look at oversight and what that is. We're going to take a look at the lawmaking process, how a bill becomes a law. We're going to take a look at the leadership within Congress. And we talked about in the political parties chapter how that political parties do determine how the leadership structure in Congress is going to be, right? We talked about how that the majority party in each of the two chambers is going to determine who the leadership is going to be, right? So the Senate Majority Leader is always going to be a member of the majority party. The Speaker of the House is also going to be a member of the majority party within those respective chambers, right? And we'll talk about the similarities and differences between those two chambers, right? Because as we also mentioned in Chapter 2, that the House has their responsibilities, such as beginning, bills having to do with money, appropriations, all of that starts in the House. The impeachment process also starts in the House as well, and then the Senate has their own unique responsibilities, such as the confirmation of federal officers, as well as serving as the jury, so to speak, with the impeachment, right? Because the Senate is the one who ultimately decides whether to remove a executive officer or a federal judge, right? Because it's not just the president who is subjected to the impeachment, right? There's also these other federal officers can also be subjected to it as well. So we'll talk about impeachment here towards the end of the chapter. So, okay, let's go ahead and start. Okay, so we're going to be kind of taking a look a little bit in terms of, when we look at Congress in terms of why they're there, right, and how they're how it's set up, right? So obviously, of course, members of Congress must be responsive to their constituents. Constituency are the residents in the area from which an official is elected, right? We talked about this a little bit when we talked about voting, right? We talked about how that when you register to vote, and then you get that, that voter card in the mail, which you don't need to go and vote. Some people, they take it with them, which is good that they take it with them. But it's basically just for your information, so that you can know, who your elected officials are, right? Because constituency is based on where you live. We talked about this before, right? That that because depending on where you live, that'll determine who your constituency is. So I'll give myself as an example. So obviously, of course, living in the United States, I am a constituent of the President of the United States, the current President Joe Biden. I am a constituent of the two senators that represent Texas, Ted Cruz and John Cornyn. I am also a constituent of, because those the two senators from Texas serve statewide, right? It's not like Ted Cruz takes one half of the state and John Cornyn takes the other half. No, they are both senators statewide. So that's why I've always mentioned that, being a senator from Texas would be very, very difficult because being responsible for 30 million people, as opposed to maybe being like a senator like in Rhode Island, where Rhode Island is basically like the size of Hidalgo County. So you can easily represent that area because it's a lot smaller, right? But anyway, with that being said, so let's continue. So then, of course, my House representative is Monica de la Cruz. So I'm a constituent of hers, and then we move on down to the state level, such as Governor Greg Abbott, and then even moving down to my state rep is Bobby Guerra, my state senator is Juan Chuy Hinojosa, and then you move down even further, right? When we look at local government, and that's just a few of the state offices, right? There's a bunch more state offices, but we're just kind of taking a look at the more popular ones. If you go on down to local government, right? I'm a constituent of Judge Richard Cortez, the judge of Hidalgo County, and things like that. And we move you down even further than that, right? Because it moves on down to even city and school board. So we are all members of that constituency, right? So it depends on where I live, right? So because I live in the city of Mission, I'm a constituent of the local community, right? And then even more so with the school district I live in the Sherryland area, right? So that's my constituency, right? So your all's constituency would look different depending on where you live, right? So even at the local level, it looks even more different because again, that's we live in different areas, right? So that's the way constituency works, right? That the people who live in that district that these members of Congress represent, and the members of Congress do have to be responsive to the constituency's needs, which we'll talk about that here in a bit. The Constitution created a bicameral legislature, which is a legislative body consisting of two chambers, right? We discussed this in Chapter 2, right? In Congress, those two chambers are the House and the Senate, right? Because remember in Chapter 2 we talked about the New Jersey plan versus the Virginia plan, right? We talked about how the Virginia plan wanted representation in Congress to be based solely on population. And so that would have given larger populated states like Virginia more of an advantage because, to them that made a lot of sense, right? That, hey, we got more people, so we need more political power because there's more people that we are responsible for, right? Whereas the New Jersey plan wanted, the New Jersey plan, of course, wanted a system where you had equal representation, right? Because, hold on, please. So in New Jersey, obviously, of course, New Jersey was a smaller populated state, and they were making the argument, hey, why do the more highly populated states get more political power? That's not fair for us more rural, less populated states, right? So that's why, they came up with a great compromise, which incorporates both of these, both of these methods in terms of representation in the Congress, right? Where we have two chambers, where the House is based on population, the Senate is based on equality, right? That's why in Texas we have a lot more members of the House as opposed to smaller states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Alaska, things like that, in terms of, small in terms of population. But then every state gets two senators regardless of population. So Texas gets two, Rhode Island gets two. So when we look at, the two chambers have, of course, different constituencies, right? House members are more attuned to local groups, right? Because House, your House members, they're divided up by districts within a state. They're going to look at more local issues, right? Because the size of their district is not as big, right? They don't have as many people that they have to supervise, at least for the most part, right? Especially in these larger populated states. We talked about how the House seats have to be about 710,000 people, right? All of the districts have to be that amount. And we talked about that before in the previous chapter, right? When I showed you all the congressional maps. So because of this, the House members they're going to pay more attention to local issues and local interests, right? And you also have to look at how that depending on where these House districts are, that will also influence the issues that the local groups are going to be most concerned about. So examples would be like, so down here in the valley, right, we've got, we're part of District 15 here. District 28 is our neighbor in Star and Zapata and Webb County. We've also got District 34 over there in Cameron and Willacy and Kennedy County. So of course, all three of those districts, share the border with Mexico, right? So immigration and border security is definitely a huge issue when we look at our representatives here because of where they live, right, where they serve, right? Obviously, of course, having a district that's on an international border is going to necessitate the need for that to be at the top of the list of House members' political concerns because it's one of the major concerns within the community. But if you got like a district out in Kansas that is out in the middle of nowhere, isn't anywhere close to an international border, immigration and border security probably not going to be all that big of a deal, to those, to that district and the member of Congress within that district, right? So that's kind of an example of how, depending on where you live, that'll influence, those issues. So like over there in Kansas, you would probably imagine that agriculture and farming issues, right? Maybe inflation and the price of, everyday, goods, right? Like we saw recently, I'm sure you all saw they were making memes about the chicken eggs that were going up in price, right? Like one of those memes I saw was like, somebody made fun of like the Jared jewelry commercials where like, oh, like they went to Jared and then instead of like a wedding ring or something like that, it's like an egg. So it's pretty funny, like, how they were making fun of like how expensive the eggs were. So but again, so agriculture and farming would probably be more of an issue. With there in Kansas and the Great Plains states. Let me check the comment. Somebody said, Ella was laughing. Okay, yes. Yes, that I laughed too. Like I thought that was really funny. Like the internet is so funny. Okay, and then senators, of course, are more insulated from individual or narrow interests because senators have to serve on a statewide level. They are not necessarily going to be. It's not that they don't care about local issues. It's just that they've got a lot on their plate, right? So like, Ted Cruz and John Cornyn, obviously, of course, immigration and border security is very high on their list, right? But they've got other things they have to deal with, right? They have to deal with other issues that the state is dealing with, right? Maybe, like the oil and gas industry, because we've got a lot of that in Texas. They also have to deal with farming, agriculture, and ranching because Texas, even though Texas has gotten a lot more urbanized, that's not to say that there still isn't a lot of, agriculture and ranching out there. When I teach Texas government, I make this point to my students, because yes, Texas has undergone a lot of changes where Texas is a lot more urbanized than what it was 100 years ago. But it doesn't mean that the rural areas just disappeared, right? It just means that Texas has gotten more industry and it's more diverse, right? So farming and agriculture is still important to Texas. It's just that that's not the only thing that's important to Texas. We've also got oil and gas. We've got space exploration. Like we saw last week with the launching of the SpaceX rocket there, at Boca Chica Beach and all that, right? Which, by the way, I also wanted to mention that on Friday, did any of you all? We'll talk about that towards the end. I was going to mention about the hailstorm, but we'll talk about that towards the end. But yeah, so for the senators, they, of course, like I said, they have to look at issues on a statewide level. They also need to look at issues on a national level too. Not to say that House members also don't look at national issues as well. Of course, we'll talk about how political parties have a major role in that. But the senators do have to. They can't just focus on one specific issue, right? They have so much more that they're responsible for, especially in a large state like Texas, in terms of size and population. Again, that's why I would never want to be a senator from Texas. Like, could you imagine the responsibility, not just the people, but all the industry you have to worry about, all the things. No, that would just be. I don't know how Ted Cruz and John Cornyn are able to sleep at night when it comes to like the stress they must go through. Oh my goodness, that's just that would just be like a really difficult job, for anybody to do. So kudos to them for being able to handle all that stress. I do not handle stress very well. So, okay, let's move on now to differences between the House and the Senate, right? So of course there are of course some, there's age requirements, citizenship requirements. Interestingly, as I've mentioned before, there isn't necessarily a residency requirement for House. For the House. I mentioned before that you don't necessarily have to reside in your district to actually run for your House district. Now, it's not wise politically to do that because your opponent will definitely bring that up. But technically in the Constitution, it doesn't say that you actually have to reside in the district. In Texas, you do. If you want to run for a state rep or a state senator, you actually do have to live in the district. So at the state level, they have that requirement, but not at the federal level. So again, so minimum number, of course, for House is 25, Senate is for 30. U.S. citizenship, at least 7 years, Senate at least 9 years. So you can see the Senate has a little bit more stringent requirements, right? They have a longer age requirement, a longer citizenship requirement, and the term also is longer, right? We talked about how House members of the House have 2-year terms, senators 6-year terms. Number representing each state, 1 to 53 per state, depends on population. So what this means here is that every state gets at least one House member. So we talked about how and we mentioned this, right, a couple of class periods ago, right, where I showed you all the congressional map and how that all those districts are 700,000 people, right, give or take. It's not, it's like 710,000, give or take. It's not like exactly exact, but it's for the most part, right? They try to reach that ballpark figure. So if you have, so then it's just simple math, right? If you've got like a state that has like, let's say it has 1.5 million people, then that's going to be 2 House members, right? Because you simply divide it, right? 1.5 divided by 2, that's, or so 1.5 divided by 700, and that gives you 2, right? So there you have your 2 House seats, right? So the larger states, so California is going to have 53 because they're the most highly populated state, and then Texas is next after that. Then of course we have other populated states like New York, Florida. Those are the ones who have, then they come next in terms of their House delegation. But in the Senate, of course, obviously, each state gets 2 senators regarding population. Constituency, of course, is local because it's a district for the House, and then for the Senate, it's statewide here. Okay, now members of Congress may interpret their jobs in one of 2 ways. We're going to take a look at the delegate and the trustee model. So also, everyone, we might go a little bit over today because I want to try to get at least towards half of this as possible. So we might need to stay a little bit longer if that's okay with you all. But let me just take a quick drink of water here really quickly. I have a research paper and a final exam I have to finish by the end of the semester. So you can imagine I'm also stressed. I'm there with you all. I am there with you all with what we have to do. So let's take a look at members of Congress, okay, in terms of how they interpret their job. So we're going to take a look at the delegate model and the trustee model. Okay, so the delegate model of representation talks about how representatives should act and vote in accordance with the preferences of their constituents. So this is talking about how that if you are a member of Congress and you operate on the delegate model of representation, this means that pretty much all the decisions that you make are not necessarily yours to make, but it's left up to the constituents that vote for you, right? So the idea is that, you have this position, this job within Congress, right? You were elected by the people. And so the people should ultimately decide what you're going to do, right? Because the people sent you, right? The people picked you to go and represent them. So we talked about how, members of Congress definitely do need to listen to the constituents, right? Because the voters are the people that decide whether, who serves in Congress, right? Who gets elected and who doesn't, right? So the delegate model, this puts, obviously, of course, this puts, what it does here is that it puts in the mind of the member of Congress here that, hey, they got to do what their constituents are telling them to do, right? They've got to, even if it might be something that they might disagree with, they feel that their hands are tied because they have to go along with what their constituents are saying, right? Now, the trustee model of representation is different here. Representatives should act and vote in accordance with what they think is best for their constituents. Now, the trustee model takes into account remember how we talked before, at the beginning of class, and we've talked about it throughout the class, that Americans tend to not be all that informed about government. They tend to either not care, or it's hard for them to figure it out because it's complex and they don't have the time to sit down and actually research this stuff. Who wants to do that on their own time, so to speak, right? So because that's not a secret, the member of Congress that operates under a trustee model feels that because of their expertise, because the voters voted for them to kind of do it, kind of make those decisions for them because they might not necessarily either care or not or know what's going on. They're not there in Congress, so they might not know the ins and outs of what's going on a day-to-day basis. The trustee model allows for representatives to make decisions on behalf of their constituents because the constituents might not necessarily know what's best, so to speak, right, in terms of, because they might not have all the information handy that the elected official does. Now, again, this is two ways of kind of in terms of how members of Congress approach legislation, how they approach their job, how they approach their committee assignments, and ultimately what they're going to do in their capacity. But before we move on, I wanted to just see what you all thought about this, right? I mean, when we look at these two models, I mean, what do y'all think? I mean, um, which of these two would you do? Oh, by the way, Ariana, thank you so much for stopping by here. Which of these two do you think you all would favor? If, like, let's say you were doing their job, would you go with the delegate model or the trustee model? Which of these two do you think you would prefer to do if, let's say, you were in Congress? Like, how would you do things? So Elva says the delegate model. Okay, all right. So why would you go with the delegate model between the two of these?
In my opinion, I would go with the delegate model because I'm there to represent the wants and needs of my constituents
Mhm.
and not to further my own personal opinion or agenda. So I feel a delegate does a better job of representing their constituents.
Okay, sounds good. Yes, and that's definitely a very popular sentiment, right? That hey, the reason why we have this job is because the people elected me. So, I definitely need to do what the people are telling me to do because they're the ones who sent me. Yes, exactly. That's a very popular notion. But let's kind of look at it, from the other perspective, right? But what happens if, let's say, you're there and let's say you've got two groups of people within your district and they want totally different things, right? Let's say there's disagreement. Let's say you're in a district where like half of them want you to do this and half of them want you to do the other thing. What would you do then? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm just wanting to, because this actually does happen.
I
So
mean,
what would you do?
as the democracy that we're supposed to be, not everyone is going to be represented. So obviously, I would have to go with what the majority of the people are asking or seeking. Um, Again, that's just as a delegate. If I had another option to pick from, like a Politico, then I would assume the role of that.
Right, right. And the reason why I asked this question is because yes, I think we've all established it's not like there's going to be a member of Congress or any elected official, at least if they're smart. They're not going to be like, oh, I'm not going to listen to what the constituencies want, right? Obviously, of course, they need to because they serve in the public. So you need to definitely take into consideration what the public is saying. You need to be receptive to making yourself available to the public, right? I've said before about, like how I have to have office hours, right? So I need to be available for you all. Well, elected officials need to have their version of office hours as well, right? They need to have town halls, they need to reach out to the community and things like that. But the point I'm trying to make is that because not a lot of people are really either have the time, and we talked before about how that's why my mom is really political because she's got a lot of time to be. When she was working, she never was. And even though I teach political science, it's not like I can go to Austin and go to like the protests and the rallies that a lot of my activist friends go to because they're working for a lot of these nonprofits, and so that's kind of their job, right? But the point I wanted to make is that the point I'm trying to make here is that if you have a situation where the public might not necessarily be all that aware of what's going on and they might not necessarily know what's going on, this does allow for the trustee model to also come into play, right? If, let's say, um, so the way it works normally is that these members of Congress try to do a little bit of both, right? They try to play both roles, so to speak, right? Where they try to, of course, wouldn't the political model embrace both? Well, Right, because it's true that you need to try to do both. It's just that it might be hard to do that, right? Especially if you got a situation where, because that's why I asked you that question. What happens if you've got half of your district wanting you to do something and then half doing the other? Which, let me say really quickly, I've thought about this, and I actually see what you all think about this. I've thought about that. Like, if I was in that situation, if I've got half of people want me to do something, the other half want me to do something else. If I'm going to piss off half the people, that actually makes it kind of easy. Then I'm just going to go. I'm just going to do what I feel is best. Because if you know, does that kind of make sense in terms of what I'm saying? That actually makes it kind of easy. Because, well, you know, if half of the people don't like it and they're not going to like what I'm going to do, then I'll just go do what I feel is best. You know, so I kind of look at it that way. And I don't know. Some people might be like, well, we still got to try to see if we can kind of compromise and get with the other group. But if you've tried that and they're still not budging, then it kind of makes it sort of easy, right? I just kind of accept that half of the people are going to be mad at me anyway. So then I'll just do what I feel is best. So that's kind of like how I would do both, right? You know, but that's kind of like an extreme example. But yes, it is, right? But and again, and that's why, of course, you leave that as like a last resort where you try to see if you can win over at least some of the 50%. So this is like an extreme scenario where if you can't and you're just like, you know, like half of these people are going to hate me anyway. So, well, anyway, you know, so it kind of decides it for me. But yes, but right. In an ideal world, of course, you would want to try to see maybe you could win, you know, win over maybe another 20%, and then it becomes more like 60-40 and things like that. And, you know, so then you can make the argument, well, you know, this is what the majority wants. But yes, it's the reason why I bring up these scenarios is because I want you all to understand that it's not that easy, right? Like it's not that easy to just go with one or the other, right? You kind of you need to take a little bit of both, and you need to try to see if you can. You have to be a good diplomat, so to speak, right? You have to be very diplomatic with the way you handle these issues and the way you talk to your constituents, which is why, unfortunately, sometimes some of these members of Congress, and not just Congress, but other elected officials, might not try to go meet with the constituents because they feel that it might do them more harm than good. Unfortunately, I would argue that being a parent has prepared me for such a role. Yes, yes, exactly, yes. It's just there's a reason why a lot of elected officials don't hold town hall meetings and they try to kind of avoid it. They kind of try to duck away from it because again, it becomes a situation where you might have like two competing groups of people like kind of putting you on the spot. But I mean, that's what you signed up for, you know. So if it's too much for you, then you know, let someone else do it who can handle it, you know. So I don't know. I'm not really the type that has like sympathy for like elected officials, especially like if they lose an election, they're gonna be okay. Like you know, they made a lot of contacts, you know, they'll be fine. I don't ever feel like oh they lost their job. No, uh they're when you know even people who run for something and they don't win are better off. Like I've got several of my friends of mine who nobody knew who they were, and now they've got all these followers on Twitter because they ran for something even if they didn't win. So you know that it benefits you, you know, even if maybe you don't necessarily win or if you don't end up keeping your seat, like you're still pretty well off. So, but anyway, I just wanted for us to just kind of talk about that a little bit because yeah, it is a little bit it is something that you know some people if they really think about it, it can be a little bit more difficult to kind of look at here. Okay, let's see. Okay, let's kind of run through a little bit more of this, and then we'll see if we can finish up here in a bit. Okay, so descriptive and substantive representation allows for trusting a person to speak or represent another. So descriptive representation is in which representatives have the same racial, gender, ethnic, religious, or educational backgrounds of their constituents, based on the principle that if two individuals are similar in background, character, interests, and perspectives, then one can correctly represent the other's views. So descriptive representation, of course, is this is kind of like some voter psychology here where voters will they'll try to make connections with certain candidates, and then we also see this in terms of how candidates also try to make connections with their constituents and the communities, right? This is why, and we talked about this before, right? This is why a lot of these political ads look really similar. Like you'll have like the candidate there, like with their family, and they'll be like outside, like enjoying like a nice day or things like that, because they want for the voters to feel that these people are just like them, that they're also part of the community. You know, some of these ads will talk about that they went to school here and they did this and that, and you're just trying to connect with the community, right? So because there is something to that, right? That voters definitely want to feel like the person that's representing them is just like them, right? And is from the community. Even though, of course, we're going to talk about how that in terms of the typical profile of a member of Congress, they're usually not like a lot of people in the community, and that they tend to be a lot more wealthier and more highly educated and have more connections. But in those ads, they try to make them look like they are part of the community. That's why a lot of these ads look very similar. And then substantive representation, representatives can be held accountable to their constituencies, like we were talking about right now, creates electoral incentives to act on constituent interests and provide good representation. So the idea is that in a healthy democracy, you have lots of substantive representation where the idea is that the public is supposed to hold elected officials accountable, right? They're supposed to be held accountable when it comes to looking at the jobs that they're doing, looking at the legislation that they introduce, or the legislation that they vote on, or either vote for, vote against, just how they're doing their job, right? That the public is supposed to be holding them accountable. The problem, though, of course, as we talked about, is that the public doesn't really hold elected officials accountable when they're on the job. They usually just kind of only hold them accountable during election season. And even then, since we don't have very high voter turnout, it becomes a situation where these elected officials can kind of keep getting reelected, because if the voters aren't really all that in tune, that they can try to, yeah, I mean, they still have to get more votes than the other person, but the way they do it is that they try to run a lot of these ads, and they get a lot, they get a lot of these donors to put up signs. And so it's not necessarily about actually going and talking to people in the community to try to get them their vote. It's just kind of doing it a little bit more flashy, so to speak, right? Because it is hard work to go and actually talk to people. But that is the way it's supposed to be done. But again, so because of the fact that people aren't really keeping tabs, and the only time they usually do keep tabs is during election season, which again, as we've talked about, it's nobody's fault. People are busy. People don't have time. I don't even have time to be keeping up with what Monica de la Cruz is doing. I don't have time to be like looking up, okay, she voted on this, she voted on that, what committee, what is she doing in the committees she's serving on? It's a lot of work, right? And things like that. So because, for the average person, they can't really keep up with what's going on, it creates a situation, and this isn't just in Congress, in local government, it's even more egregious, because at least with Congress, there's a national press that is covering Congress, right? I mean, you've got all these newspapers and all these newspapers and news organizations. They have their own like beat reporters that just cover politics, right? I'm sure you're familiar with them, right? That these newspapers, they have a whole section devoted to like political news. Political news is something that is one of the most important news areas that the newspapers and the news media covers, right? So they've definitely got that down pat, right? And of course their focus is more on the national news, right? Like Congress and the presidency. Uh, in Texas we have like some state newspapers, like the Texas Tribune, and then your local newspapers. You will usually, try to do a decent job, like the Austin American Statesman, because they're in Austin and that's where the capital is. They can definitely cover a lot of state news, but as you get down to the local news, it becomes a lot harder for, like the Monitor or some of these other, the Valley Morning Star, the Brownsville Herald. It's and then of course like KRGV, KGT, and then of course we got the Spanish media like Telemundo, Univision. It's difficult for them to cover the local, what's going on in local politics. They try their best, but because they're just limited in staff and resources, they're not able to maybe keep tabs on local government as much as the national media covers Congress. Does that kind of make sense? That as you get lower down to the lower levels of the media, it becomes a lot harder for them to be able to hold the local officials accountable. So okay, let's talk a little bit more, and then we'll end for today. So let's talk a little bit about the composition of the U.S. Congress. So let's talk about race and gender. So there are increasing numbers of African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and women in the U.S. Congress, especially women in Congress. The Congress is definitely a lot more diverse now than what it was, 100 years ago. And we see more of that diversity when it comes to women, because again, this is the chart, right? The chart shows that, as you can see, since pretty much the 2000s, the number of women have skyrocketed, right? And especially here in the 2015 election, right? We see that the number of women have really, really increased in Congress, and this has led to groups like the Squad, right, where we have AOC, Ariana Presley, and then we've also got more recently, like on the Republican side, we've got Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, so we've seen a lot more women get elected, to Congress here, as well as some senators like Kristen Sinema out of Arizona, Jill Brandover in Minnesota. So we've seen more, and of course obviously Hillary Clinton, was a longtime senator from New York as well. So we've seen more. So as you can see here, the chart shows that women have been the fastest growing group here. And the other groups have kind of lagged behind a little bit here. We've seen more African Americans. Latinos have also gone up, although they've taken a dip in more recent years. And then we've also seen a more steady rise of Asian American Pacific Islanders, like Ro Khanna. He would be an example. And then of course we've got a few Native Americans here as well, but not too many. So, but yeah. So obviously, of course, we're seeing a greater number of these minority groups and women in Congress, but their representation is not comparable to their proportions in the general population. So obviously, of course, what this means here is that the demographics of America do not necessarily reflect there's not necessarily that strict correlation between American demographics and members in Congress, right? There still is an overwhelmingly large amount of white male members of Congress. Another thing that also isn't quite mentioned here is the age too, right? That members of Congress tend to be older, right? There's a lot of old people in Congress, right? If you think Bernie Sanders is old, there's people older than him. Chuck Grassley, who just got reelected in Iowa, he's almost 90. Like, just think about that, right? So there's a lot of like older people, within Congress, right? And especially like within the Senate and things like that, right? So that's something also that doesn't really get talked about, right? Is that the people that are in Congress do not necessarily represent the demographics of the United States as a whole, right? Most members of Congress come from the legal profession, though others have experience in public service or ties to business and industry, right? So we also see that the professions within Congress also tend to be skewed towards. It becomes skewed more towards professions where you can kind of set your own schedule and kind of be your own boss. Like I know, like if you're an attorney in a law firm, obviously, of course, you're trying to move up, to kind of be like, be your own practicing attorney and things like that. But at the same, and so, but again, that caters more towards, these high-ranking attorneys that can kind of set their own schedule. I talk a little bit more about this in Texas government, like when we look at people that serve in the Texas legislature, and then business owners as well. They can kind of, since they kind of run their own business, they can kind of set their own schedule, things like that. Because the everyday professional is not going to be able to serve in Congress, right? Because you can't keep your job and then go serve in Congress, right? So this is why this attracts a lot of these people that tend to either run their own business or they're retired. So that's also why we tend to see some more older people, because the nature of the job does not lend it for people to be able to kind of leave their current job, and go run for some of these things, especially like in the House when you have to run for re-election every 2 years. I mean, could you imagine, like, especially when and the pay is, I guess you could say, sort of decent. It's about 175,000. But of course, there's also a lot of expenses, right? You have to constantly fly to Washington. You're going to have to find a place in Washington. That can be very expensive. So in reality, a lot of that is going to be eaten up by travel and living costs, right? So, and you have to worry about keeping your job every 2 years, right? So that's why, like, there's a lot of people, like, in the community who probably wouldn't do that job, because it's just, yes, there's a lot of power in it, but there's also a lot of instability, right? So, and the members of Congress are more highly educated than most Americans. Of course, a lot of them are highly educated. Some of them have doctorates. Not too many of them, but some of them have doctorates, but a lot of them have like bachelor's and master's degrees and things like that. So again, this is not necessarily reflective of the general population, right? Because not everyone in America has a degree, right? There's still a lot of people who are just high school educated, right? That there's still a good number of people in the United States who who have not gone to college, right? So again, so all of this is but at the same time, some people, might say, well, yeah, we definitely want for someone who's highly educated and someone who's been successful in their career to go and represent us, right? I mean, I know for me personally, I definitely, that's the first thing I look at. If let's say someone is running for something, I want to look at what their credentials are, right? So if you want me to vote for you, you need to show that you are capable of doing this job, right? You need to show to me that you know what you're talking about, that that you're intelligent, that you've done something with your life, type of thing. So I totally get as to why a lot of members in Congress do tend to be highly educated and have successful careers, right? Because if we're going to trust you, we want to make sure that you're going to be doing the best job for us, right? Representatives as agents. So we'll finish up in just a couple of minutes. Let me just kind of reach this the middle point, and then we'll pick it up on Wednesday. Representatives work to speak for their constituents' views and serve their interests. Members of Congress communicate with their constituents through email, websites, blogs, and social media, especially like social media. Social media has definitely become uh, a huge way for members of Congress and just politicians in general to be able to communicate, right? I mean, we talked about how Trump used Twitter when he was still on it, right? And so pretty much any high-ranking elected official is going to have some sort of social media presence because yes, they have their websites, right? Like obviously, of course, like like the President of the United States has their official government website. Um, but how often do people actually check that, right? It's a lot easier for people to just check President Biden's, official like Twitter account and things like that, So so obviously, of course, social media is a major way that people are able to get their information from Congress and other elected officials. And they also spend considerable time and staffing on constituency service, which is called casework. Casework is basically when like when you all email me about stuff like Ms. Gonzalez, that that there's an issue with like I need like I wanted an extension on something. That's basically what casework is, right? Where you go to the member of Congress and you talk to them about an issue that you're experiencing and you want to know if they can help you out, right? Let's say there's an issue with your business and the IRS is like kind of like hounding you or whatever. So that might be an opportunity for you to go reach out to your member of Congress and just see if there's anything they can do to help, right? Um, so again, it's a similar thing like what you all do, like when you all like email me about things in the class, right? That's what casework is. Many districts have 2 or 3 issues that are top priorities for constituents and therefore for representatives. So like we talked about, every district's going to be different in terms of what those top priorities are. Now, the economy usually is always something that is evident in pretty much all the districts. I mean, that's usually always at the top of the list in terms of issues that people have or concerns that people have, because the economy is on. You could say the economy kind of, I don't want to say it's everything, but if you don't have, if you don't have stable income coming in, if you don't have a means to support yourself, then everything else is going to suffer, right? Your health's going to suffer, your well-being is going to suffer. And that's of course why people's jobs are like, I don't want to say it's the most important thing in people's lives, but it's definitely something that people definitely make a huge priority of. That's why everyone always talks about work whenever they go to like family events or something like that. I know for my family, all we talk about is work. We noticed that when we were younger. Like, why do the grown-ups always just talk about their jobs all the time? And now we're doing it. Now we just talk about our jobs all the time. I guess that's just how it is anyway. But okay, so let's move on here. Okay, so let's see. I want to just make sure to see. Okay, so 3 factors, of course, affect who gets elected, who runs for Congress. Potential candidates must have ambition and the ability to raise money. So again, this is no different than what we've discussed before in terms of who makes the best candidate for any type of elected office. But again, because Congress tends to be one of the most prestigious elected offices in the entire country, it's definitely going to attract a lot of people to want to try to get in there, right? A lot of members of Congress you do usually tend to have they usually have previous political experience. Some of them have been like I know Greg Gassar, the new congressman over out in the Austin area. He was a longtime Austin City Council member. Uh, some of the other ones have also been state reps and state senators before. So they've served in elective office before, and that usually operates as a stepping stone in order to move up, to Congress. So that's why it's not all that uncommon to see members of Congress have other previous political experience because they've done this before. They know how to fundraise and get messages out and try to win elections because they've won elections before at a lower level. Um, but yes, definitely the ability to raise money is extremely important, right? Without, as we talked about in the campaign chapter last time, if you don't have money, your campaign is not going to go anywhere. That's why a lot of these, like especially like when they run for president, like when they say they're suspending their campaign, it's mostly because they just ran out of money. They would like to keep going, but if they don't have money, then they're not going to be able to, right? Because you're not going to be able to pay your staffers. They're not going to work for free. You're not going to be able to run television ads because, and if you can't run ads, then how are you going to get your name out there, right? So yeah, so the ability to raise money as well as, the candidates, having ambition and being, having the, good qualities that people can relate to are extremely important for people to be able to run for Congress. The incumbency, holding the political office for which one is running. So incumbency, we talked about how that incumbents definitely have a huge advantage over challengers because incumbents can say that they've done the job before. They can point to, okay, I introduced this legislation, I served on this committee, I voted for the passage of this bill, and this bill was, and this bill became a law, and this law was able to get get our district, a lot of money. We were able to get like $2 million from this, this law that was passed. So these are the things that I've done. Whereas a challenger can only say what they're going to do. And again, it's just like in a job interview, like I mentioned before, right? That the people who have a better chance of getting hired are the ones who have done similar work before, So you can say that you've done this, 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 and this, as opposed to someone who hasn't done it. Then yeah, then you're going to be a more attractive candidate. But yes, incumbents can provide constituent services like we were talking about, casework, as well as pork barrel spending. Pork barrel is appropriations made by legislators for local projects. Now, that's what pork barrel, of course, is a funny term because it gets a negative connotation because it implies that government is getting fat because it's spending all this money that's not necessary, just like, a fat pig as it's just, eating all the slop or whatever and things like that. So the reason why it gets a negative connotation is because let me explain how this works. So if let's say you are a member of Congress and you want to try to get funding for local projects in your community, first off, that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to want to do stuff for your community, right? Because they elected you, you want to help out, your community, you want to do what you can to try to get jobs for your constituents and try to better the circumstances of the people in your community. So then in this bill, let's say, you request, for funding for this project. So then that passes. But say another member of Congress says, hey, wait a minute. They just got this, this big project in their community. I want one. So then the next bill, they get one. And then someone else says the same thing. I want one. And then do you see why this becomes a problem where now everybody wants a special project in their local community? And then that just increases the cost of government immensely for everyone because now everybody wants a project. Which again, at the same time, I understand why they want their projects, right? And this goes back to this whole idea of, as a member of Congress, are you more concerned about your local district and the people in your community, or are you more concerned about the nation as a whole, right? It's kind of going back to the delegate versus the trustee model, right? You can make another argument. This is kind of a similar thing, right? Where, like in the House, right? Our House members, are they more loyal to what their people back home want them to do? Or could it be more about what the nation itself wants them to do? That's kind of a tough one, right? So just kind of think about that when we look at why pork barrel spending tends to be controversial. And they did try to. This is also called earmarks. That's another term for it. And they did try to pass legislation that dealt with this. Just want to make sure that it. No, that's fine. We can end here for today. So but yeah, they had, because an earmark is another term for pork barrel spending because that's what the appropriations for the local projects called. It's called an earmark, and so they did try to pass legislation that rolled back the earmarks, but now it's just kind of been it's hard to kind of do that because everyone is going to want to do something for the community, and of course incumbents also have superior access to campaign funds, right? Because they've run before, they've gotten elected before, because that's an important thing to remember is that you do not have to spend all of your campaign money in that election. It's not a use it or lose it type of thing. You can save that money and you can carry it on to future elections. So because you're already there, you also so again, so you can save what you didn't spend to get in initially, and then once you're there, you get more access to more people, right? You get, now that you're a sitting member of Congress, you get to meet more people, you get to meet more donors, and it just expands your social network for campaign funds and campaign contributions. So that's why people that are already serving in Congress have a built-in advantage over challengers, because the challenger has to get their name out, whereas the people who are already in Congress already know a lot of people, and they'll definitely have a big money advantage. And then, of course, the drawing of House districts are going to be drawn to give one candidate a big advantage. We talked about this before. We talked about the redistricting and the gerrymandering, right? Apportionment and redistricting occur after each decennial census. Apportionment processes the process that allocates congressional seats among 50 states. And the redistricting, of course, is the process of redrawing the election districts and redistributing those legislative representatives based on the apportionment numbers, right? So you apportion the seats based on population numbers, and then you redraw the lines to better fit, to fit those population changes, like we talked about before, right? Of course, we also talked about gerrymandering, right? Redistricting is a highly political process. Districts are shaped to create an advantage for the party in control of the redistricting process, where you draw the lines to benefit one party over another. And partisan gerrymandering has led some states to take redistricting power away from state legislatures and give it to independent bipartisan commissions, such as California. I know they've done they've made some changes where instead of the state legislators, instead of the politicians drawing the lines, instead you have these independent commissions to do it. So I think we can go to an end here we'll go to an end for today. We'll start on the organization of Congress next time. So we're going to discuss the role of political parties in Congress. We're going to talk about the committee system, because this is where Congress does pretty much almost all their work, their heavy lifting is through the committee system. We'll talk about the congressional staffers, the caucuses, the groups of Congress, such as like the Freedom Caucus, and there's also the Problem Solvers Caucus. These are groups of members of Congress with like-minded goals, and also the rules of the House and Senate. We'll take a look at like the filibuster and stuff like that. So we'll go to the end for today. Okay, so let me stop the share really quickly. Let me also stop the recording here really quickly. So